And welcome to the UK SIF Leadership Podcast. It's Sally here on the 25th of October 2022, and the FCA has just launched their long-awaited SDR consultation. It's been almost a year in the making, with input from the Disclosures and Labels Advisory Group, known as the DLAG, a group made up of 15 members, 3 observers, and chaired by the FCA. We're delighted to be represented by our CEO, James, as one of the members of the working group. So, unsurprisingly, and I'm sure you'll be glad to hear, that instead of me, you'll mainly be hearing from James on this episode. James, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks very much, Sally. It's great to be on the podcast again and for us to be doing the podcast again. We've had a bit of a break from podcasting, but we're hoping to bring this back a bit more regularly. And I think what better time to start than with the launch of this pretty monumental piece of work.
Yeah, definitely. So let's just launch straight in. How did SDR come about?
So over the last few years, the FCA has been rightfully, in our opinion, very concerned about greenwashing, and greenwashing has really taken over the agenda. We've heard an awful lot about greenwashing as one of the big barriers to sustainable investment. It erodes trust in the industry. It has led to people, we think, not investing in a sustainable way because they feel that it's not going to actually deliver on their sustainability objectives. And of course, our view as UK SIF is that greenwashing actually harms the leaders. If you are going out of your way to enhance what you're doing, to improve your work, to get better data, to do more analysis, and yet your competitor can just put together a nice brochure that's done by a good marketing department and it looks good and glossy with pictures of polar bears and wind turbines on it, and to even a professional advisor, those two things are somewhat indistinguishable, then there's a real problem. And those leaders are being harmed in that process. So for us, it's very strongly about, how do we address this greenwashing problem? And actually, the FCA has recognized that this is a major problem. So they put out a letter, they call it the Dear Chair letter. It went to chairs of investment funds and others. And in that, they basically said that they put out some principles around sustainability and how a fund should be described as sustainable. But what they also said is that they think that there is a risk of mis-selling from funds that are labeled as sustainable or ESG or green or whatever, and that is something that they are concerned about. So interestingly, and what's really interesting about this is it's not being considered as part of the perhaps additional wider remit that the FCA has around net zero, achieving the UK's net zero goals. It's being considered through the lens of consumer protection. And that's a really, really key part of this. The FCA's number one objective is consumer protection, and that is how they're looking at this. And I think a really key part of how the philosophy behind all this work.
And what has UK SIF contributed to SDR and the consultation we're seeing today?
So we've been part of the DLAG, you mentioned earlier, the Disclosures and Labels Advisory Group. We're really proud to have a seat on that table. It's been a really important working group. The conversations there have been absolutely fantastic. And what that's been looking at is, we've had for a good more than a year now, we've had conversations, very regular conversations across that group with key people in the FCA. I want to particularly call out Mark Manning and Gwyl, who are, really driving this forward, as well as Sasha Sedan and as director of ESG. And we've had some amazing conversations, discussions, at times quite challenging. There have been differences of opinion, but I think everybody on that group has been committed to moving this industry forward, to creating that integrity of sustainable finance that we want to see. And addressing some of these challenges. So yeah, we've been part of DLAG. We've worked as well as with members to make sure that we are effectively and capturing what members think, so that we're able to pass on the views of industry as part of this process. But importantly, this has been about giving UK SIF and our members a voice in this whole process. On top of the DLAG, we also responded to the consultation that came out before this. So there was a discussion paper that was published during COP26, which gave the kind of first draft of some of these works. And so anyone that studied that consultation paper will recognize quite closely some of what's coming out today. There have, of course, been changes and we think improvements to that whole process. We're pleased to have been able to contribute to that. And actually our response to that consultation paper, I think we had more input from members than we had on any consultation that's been out for the last few years. And we're really pleased and excited that that members are so engaged in this process and there's been so much industry engagement in this.
Now, I know this is a big question, but could you give us a broad overview of the SDR approach?
Well, big question indeed. Yeah. So broadly, the SDR it creates two things. And first of all, just to say, it is very much building on the EU's SFDR. As we know, the EU was a real first mover in this space and has been on a whole range of issues, whether it's on SFDR through to the green taxonomy. We can perhaps talk more about the green taxonomy at another time, because there's lots happening on that in the UK too. But in terms of how this is being built on, we, of course, part of what we said to ministers in the FCA was, don't diverge unnecessarily from things like the SFDR unless there's areas where it's not working. And I think what has sadly become clear over the last, good few months is the SFDR in the EU is actually not working very well. There is this concept of Article 6, Article 8, and Article 9, which define different types of disclosures in funds. That is a disclosure framework. And because there is a lack of a label, inside the SFDR, what we're seeing is that people are labeling their funds as Article 8 funds or Article 9 funds, and that hasn't worked. That has, that Morningstar a few months ago had to come out and say actually a quarter of the funds that are labeled as Article 8 they no longer include in their ESG funds list, because they don't meet the sufficient criteria to be ESG or sustainable funds as far as Morningstar is concerned. And we think there are some serious problems there. And actually, Eurosif put out a few months ago a really good paper detailing how they think some of the problems with SFDR need to be addressed. And so what's exciting, I think, is that in the UK, we have built around these challenges with SFDR, and created, importantly, a fund label at the same time as creating a disclosures framework. And so that's what we have in this SDR consultation paper, is the proposal to create new fund labels. And so broadly, what's going to happen is that if you want to say that your fund is sustainable, that is now a regulatory concept. Your fund, calling your fund a sustainable fund is a regulated concept, and broadly, it's a label. So there will be either your fund is rated or is labeled as sustainable, or it isn't, and it's quite binary in that sense. And so, if it's labeled as sustainable, what does that mean? So first of all, it means it's got to have a broader objective of doing, improving the planet and or social conditions for people. So, it's got to have some wider objective. Of course, in addition to financial returns can still be the primary objective, but to have a wider objective around people and or planet, I think is a really key part of what makes it sustainable. There are obviously checks there, there's the data requirements, there's expectations of, publishing, well, why do you think this is the case? And then underneath that, in that sustainable category, so if it has an objective to improve conditions for people and or planet, there are three types of funds that can be labeled as sustainable. The first is impact funds, sustainable impact funds, and they are funds that are obviously having a positive and very much impact investing, focused on creating an impact. The second is investing in sustainable solutions, and so what that means is, so for example, if your fund is your wider impact that you're trying to have or benefit you're trying to have is around reducing carbon emissions, you might be investing in solar arrays or solar panels or companies producing solar panels, that sort of thing. That would be investing in the sustainable solutions. And the third, and we think one of the most exciting pieces here, particularly given that we know so much of the economy is not in the place where it needs to be. There's a lot of 90% of the economy is not moving in the right direction at the right speed that we need to be moving. And so there's a huge role for investors to play to get those companies and to get those parts of the economy to become more sustainable. And so for that purpose, there is this sustainable improvers category, and that is for companies or assets that are not currently at that level that they'd be regarded as sustainable, but crucially, through a bit of investor support, investor action, investor engagement, they can become more sustainable over time. And so one of the key components of this is it's basically a transitioning funds. Now, interestingly, the FCA did consumer research as part of this process to try and understand what consumers thought about different terminology, different words, different approaches. And there's some amazing research being published at the same time as this consultation paper. I'd advise anybody that has that is consumer facing in your work or your brand or your approaches to go and look at that consumer research. I think it's a real gold mine of intelligence on what consumers think. But words like transition don't mean anything to your regular consumer. And so sustainable improvers is what this category has been called as. And so that is about how investors can use their stewardship approaches to make those companies more sustainable over time. And I think that's a really exciting piece. Now, an important other piece to consider here is that is not These are not designed to be a hierarchy. There's not designed to say actually sustainable improvers is lower down the pecking order than an impact fund. And what it's really about is saying there are different approaches that investors want to take to managing their money. Different investors are going to have different risk appetites in the same way they're going to have different values that they want to reflect. And so, these are not supposed to be a hierarchy, but also equally, it's not just about, improvements around climate change. There can be funds that are around social issues, or funds that are around workers' rights, or the just transition, or other, biodiversity and other environmental features. That is a really exciting piece of this too. This is not about the FCA prescribing the values that should be reflected, nor is it about the FCA saying there should be more sustainable funds. This is about saying, if you want to call your fund sustainable, then it has to meet a certain set of criteria, which should eliminate the greenwashing. And I think that's a really key part of this. Of course, the FCA has said, this is all going to be reviewed over time to see if it's bedding in properly. And, this is not necessary. We know that there's been a huge amount of thought being done on this. There's been the first consultation on the discussion paper. This is a second round of consultations. So there's another huge opportunity for people to get their views reflected, and to bring their views into play to make sure this is as good as it possibly can be. And we actually want this to become a leading framework that other countries might consider adopting as well. So, we're really excited about this opportunity for people to reflect their values in investing, to have more confidence in what they're investing in, and then at the same time to have this framework that's respected across the world. Finally, to say, and I appreciate I've been going on a bit, but finally just to say that there is a disclosures framework that's being built in around this, and that is to give consumers the sorts of disclosures that they might expect, and including, for example, a question mark about surprise stocks. We know that a lot of investors have been surprised to be investing in a sustainable fund and then find that it's maybe got an oil company in it, and that's been part of this wider narrative around, well, we must have been greenwashed too. So the consideration by the FCA is to say, well, if there are stocks in there that somebody might find surprising, you need to disclose that, and you need to explain why those stocks are in there. Get ahead of this narrative that this is or must be greenwashing by saying, well, actually, it's not greenwashing. We've thought about this. This is why it's in there. And it might be because we think it can improve, because we're doing lots of really good stewardship, or because, they are actually creating a product that is essential for the net zero future, or whatever it is, but I think it's about explaining that and describing why that's in there. So a huge amount in this piece of work. The consultation paper itself, I think, runs to over 170 pages. It's just going to, it's going to really transform the way that UK based funds are managed.
Thanks, James. I know that was a huge one to cover. But sort of looking forward, what are the next steps, the timescales from here? What should people be looking forward to?
So the next steps, the timescales are broadly that this consultation is open now. It's a 3-month consultation, so it will close on, I think, the 25th of January. Obviously, as UK SIF, we're going to be doing an awful lot of work to make sure that the views of the industry are incorporated into this. So we know, for example, as I mentioned, the FCA has done a lot of work to capture consumer insights and consumer views. The DLAG and others and the first consultation paper were all about getting industry views. And now we've got this finalized version that's out again to consultation. It's about getting more views of industry on how this is going to work over time, how it's going to bed in, also thinking about other parts of the industry. So what does this mean for alternative investors, for example? There are little bits in there about some views around short selling and other and derivatives, but could that go further? Are they looking at these things in the right way? Example of, what does this transition piece mean, or this sustainable improvers piece mean? And will that actually achieve what we're hoping that it will achieve? So that's all going to be in the consultation until the 25th of January. I expect that after that, the DLAG, which is this Disclosures and Labels Advisory Group that we're part of, will be reconvened to look at some of these responses, to consider where there are particular areas of concern in the responses, and think about how that might be tweaked and adapted. And the aim is that by the end of June next year, this will all come into force. And so the FCA has set out a timeline of different aspects and when they come into force. It's worth reading that in the consultation paper, but certainly some of the things will come into force on day one, and other things will have a delay of between 12 and 36 months before they come into force. Now, clearly, as you can see, if we want to see these things coming into force as quickly as possible, but also recognizing that some of these things are going to be, need time to bed in and to work and to be sort of fully implemented. And I think that makes sense as well. So yes, consultation closes end of January. This comes into force end of June, and progressively more bits come in over the following years.
And I know I've been just sort of throwing massive questions at you, but what does this mean for financial services?
I mean, talk about throwing another massive question. So, this I hope that this will transform the approaches that we take to thinking about how we determine what our funds are for, how we market those, how we sell them, and how we talk about them. And something I didn't actually mention is that, and this is something we were pushing for as part of this group, is that, the way that you describe your fund is now going to be regulated as well. So you can't say, and something I used to say regularly to the FCA, what is there to stop somebody calling their fund a Happy Polar Bears fund? Well, now that is what this is going to do. And it's, the FCA is going to start, they're going to create through this a process of principles around how you name your fund, how you describe it. And I think that's an important part of the kind of pyramid. We know that a lot of retail investors, all they look at is the name of the fund, and they say, yep, that's fine, I'm happy to go with that. There's another set of investors that will look at the kind of one paragraph description. There are some, I imagine a very small minority, that will read all the information that comes about the fund. And the key thing is each of those layers have to be consistent now. You can't have it that it's down in kind of the Annex 5 to the document on page 210 that says, actually, this is called sustainable, but this is what we really mean. It's got to all be consistent with the broader objectives of the fund. And I think that is what's going to be a really big change, is the way that consumers see what they're getting is going to be very different. And I think the really positive benefit of that is the amount that will build confidence of consumers and actually of wider institutional investors. We know that a lot of institutional investors are really excited about this process as well, because there's a lot of confidence needing to be built across the industry that when you say something is sustainable, that it actually genuinely is. And I think that's one of the most important things that we can deliver. And that's partly why we're so excited about this work.
Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, James, for that very brief overview. I hope everyone found it useful. Our members can see the policy team's full overview on the UK SIF website. And as James mentioned, we will be organising a lot of member sessions in the coming 3 months. This will be to discuss the responses to the consultation. Thanks for joining us. Click that subscribe button and you will hear more from us very soon.